Hello and welcome. This is How to Grow Your Own Food Naturally series with Tim Burrows. This is the first video, so a brief introduction into my experience with permaculture gardening and organic gardening on an urban homestead. So what is permaculture? It's kind of a hard thing to define in a way, but Oxford Dictionary defines it as the development of an agricultural ecosystem intended to be sustainable and self-sufficient. So that's all a bit kind of wordy, so let me try to break it down. So an agricultural ecosystem, you can think of an agricultural ecosystem as the opposite of an agricultural monocrop. And so a monocrop is farming all just one thing, say like a field of corn or whatever it is that you might be trying to plant, but you've left almost no room for nature. There's very little habitat for other creatures, other insects, and other natural types of plants. So as the diversity breaks down in the field, as does the support network for the accompanying animals, and the less animals you have, you start having holes in the ecosystem, and then you start having overgrowths of certain things, which you then consider pests, especially if they're the ones eating your crops. And so the more diversity you've got in your fields, in your gardens, the more resilient, because if a pest comes along or a disease comes along and it starts devouring, say, your corn crop, then you're very tempted to then use chemicals in order to sort of remedy the problem rather than having a more of a natural balance in the agricultural ecosystem. So how can nature and agriculture coexist? Well, the problem is the solution. What seems like a problem could actually be a blessing in disguise. For instance, if you've got an abundance of slugs devouring your vegetables, it could just mean that you're missing a predator species like a toad or a snake. So this abundance of slugs, you could just think of it as, could actually be remedied by also a domestic predator, such as a duck. Ducks really love slugs. And so if you're willing to incorporate a duck into your system, you would very likely have no longer an abundance of slugs. And so you can either remedy it with a natural predator or a domestic one. But by making making space for those types of animals in the garden, they can reduce your own labor greatly because you're no longer suffering from slugs. So sustainable and self-sufficient. By working with nature, like with my last example, is also an example of being sustainable and self-sufficient. The less inputs that you need to put in yourself, the more sustainable things become. Because if you don't do it, who will? And by being self-sufficient or nature sufficient, it'll be easier for you in the long term because you don't need to buy any products like pest controls that may be hard to obtain or come at some expense. And the more nature's interactions can work with each other, it becomes quite symbiotic and in balance. And when nothing gets out of balance, then it's not likely that you're going to see any major damage in your crops. So back when I was first learning, before I learned the word permaculture, I was participating in the WOOF program, which is Willing Workers on Organic Farms, or they've changed it recently to the Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms, which is a great program that you learn various techniques of organic gardening and farming, and you trade your labor in exchange for food and accommodation. And it's a great way to see the world and learn a lot of different techniques. But the main goal between all these different hosts was that we were to produce food without the input of toxic chemicals. And so a lot of different farms, a lot of different ideas, and they all had different approaches for the same goal. Organic gardening can be hard work. After much manual labor in the fields, gardening and farming by hand, I noticed certain techniques that some hosts would use that would be much more efficient than others. I tried to discuss these new techniques that I've learned with other hosts, and it usually was not very popular. The current host always thought that they knew best, and there was not a whole lot of experimenting going on. Although This is where the doors of permaculture were open to me, as the ease of the maintenance and sustainability were some of the top priorities. So not necessarily the top yield, but definitely a lot less work and more manageable and more sustainable. So permaculture, also known as natural farming. So permaculture was conceived by Bill Mollison and David Holcomb in the 1970s. It was a contraction of permanent agriculture, or permanent human culture, and it was the implementation of permanent and sustainable agricultural systems. But the term natural farming has been used for the same thing for much longer than that. So one such example of natural farming is the work and philosophy of Mansubo Fukuoka in a book called One Straw Revolution. He demonstrated that without chemical inputs or backbreaking labor, that you could get record barley and rice harvests on the same field year after year without any chemical inputs, only fertilizing with the stalks of the grains that he's taken out, and that's it. So it's pretty amazing what he's been able to accomplish. Also, he stresses the importance of keeping fruit trees, in this case mandarins, into their natural state. By trying to prune them, he said that you had to continually prune them for the rest of the tree's life, and that it'll never have a maintenance-free tree. However, if you didn't start all that maintenance to begin with, that you could actually have it in its true form with much, much less maintenance. So Sepp Holzer's permaculture is slightly different than the Australians. This is an Austrian farmer who is referred to as the best farmer in Europe. He's self-taught in natural farming approaches for over 60 years, and he does aquaculture and terracing on mountain slope. He emphasizes the importances of terraces because if you terrace it, then it means you don't need to fertilize or irrigate because the soil and water stay where it should. The 90% of the work is done. And so a terrace, if you are unfamiliar, is you can imagine a ramp and then you've carved it into a staircase. That way every step is level and it spreads and soaks the water instead of running downhill. Hugelkultur. So hugelkultur is a German word meaning mound or hill culture. The concept is to bury large amounts of organic matter as a long-term nutrient and water storage supply. As the logs and everything break down, they become quite spongy and are able to absorb a lot of nutrient and water, as well as it decomposes, it sort of acts as a decompacting tool for the soil above. The raised mounds allow a much more surface area in order to plant on, as well as create wind traps and wind breaks that can change the direction of the wind to protect other things. So you don't necessarily have to have them quite tall. You can have them flat, depending on what your needs are. But it's a nice way to get rid of a lot of uncomposted organic material, yard waste, kitchen waste, etc. So some people choose to make their raised beds very tall, so that you can harvest without having to stoop. A lot of these steep edges do erode over time, although you can sort of build a wooden frame and lattice out of natural materials that helps pin things into place a little bit better. Eventually they do slump and you need to build the bottoms of the beds back onto the tops to keep their steep angles. So here I am doing my first attempt at hugelkultur. I decided to go for a very, very steep angle and very tall bed. Decided to build the outside with pallet wood in order to sort of box it all together. And this is what I came up with. So I used additional pallet wood to box in the garden, and I filled it with soil and planted it with some plants. So a fair amount of plants did grow on the hugelkultur that I created. However, the shape of the wood was such that it tended to want to let the water roll off the garden rather than roll into the garden, and the so-called rotting wood that I had put in where it was quite fresh, and so it wasn't necessarily absorbing the huge amounts of water that I had hoped it would. So, in love with the vertical hugelkultur, I decided to go as vertical as I possibly could, and at the same time trying to fix the water flow from the previous hugelkultur attempt. This one is a cedar offcuts vertical wall. It has a bunch of angled planks that would direct the water from one level into the bottom from the bottom from one level into the top of the next level, as you can see from the next slide. So here you can see a little bit better the angle of the boards and how the water from one, they're all open, so the water would flow from one into the next, so all the rain that hits the wall will soak into the wall rather than flowing off like the old hugelkultur pyramid did. So here's a full-size example of the concept in practice. This garden wall is 8 foot tall and has a winding snake design to help cope with wind load. It's sandwiched between several cedar posts and then the cedar planks, gardens in between those. So the tall gardens are very interesting. They can have a lot of potential in certain situations. However, they would require a lot of wood, and they did tend to take a lot of frequent irrigation. And so my next garden attempt was to attempt something I saw online, and this is called a wicking bed. A wicking bed stores water underneath the soil and wicks it up into the root zone of the plants without overwatering the plants themselves. So here's my attempt at a raised wicking bed. This is built for a client on a 20th floor balcony where she found her plants were drying out very quickly and hoped for something with a little bit less maintenance. So I used a rubber liner as a water reservoir and a socked aggregate pipe to get the water under the soil, and then a piece of landscape fabric to separate the soil and the water level. So I filled the base of the soil with lots of old sticks, leaves, compost from the yard, and kitchen scraps. I filled the soil level with a triple mix just from the garden supply store, but any organic soil would be fine. And we filled the reservoir up with a lot of water, probably 100 liters of water in the base. Here we've got the garden all planted up with a few potted plants beside it. So despite being in the high winds and the hot sun, they had no trouble drying out this time. This reservoir only needed to be filled once every couple of weeks or so, or maybe even once a month. So here she has the 2 foot by 4 foot raised garden bed, pumping out tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and melons and squashes and chard and probably some other things missed in there as well. No trouble drying out and quite happy. So at the time I was still thinking about going vertical. On YouTube I discovered a project called the Garden Tower Project. It's a raised garden barrel planter on wooden legs with a vermicompost or a worm tubed in the middle. The concept being is that you would fill your food scraps into the middle bin. The worms would then feed and take their castings out through the holes in the tube into the various levels of soil. So inspired by their design, I built the garden cube. Rather than using the barrel, I used a 1,000-liter food-grade IBC tote, and instead of worm tubes, I used a clay pot irrigation system called an Oya. So what is an Oya? An Oya consists of a terracotta container designed to be inserted into the soil. The porous nature of clay allows water to pass through its surface, watering the surrounding plants without overwatering. So the capillary action comes right through the wall of the clay as long as it's unglazed clay. So in my attempt to find very large and cheap Oyas, I ended up using a clay chimney flue pipe, which seemed like a really good deal, but they were glazed clay and they didn't allow any water to weep through whatsoever, and thus defeating the purpose of using them. So don't use unglazed clay if you want to try to build an Oya. So here's the garden cube all planted up. With regular watering, it was able to supply large amounts of small plants along the edges, giving you 5 times the amount of planting surface compared to the ground. So as I developed a new love for the IBC totes, which are very cheap food-grade containers, I decided to make some large-scale wicking beds to see how they would compare to the garden cubes and the smaller wicking gardens that I had built. Although it has a lot less surface area, it has a lot more access to water, and so it's a bit of a trade-off. So here's an example of one of my large-scale wicking bins. It uses the IBC tote, so it's almost 1,000 liters, and it only needed to be filled a few times per season because it held several hundred liters of water underneath. So being inspired by the vertical garden design still, I decided to try to scale down and use an inexpensive barrel as well as a functioning clay pot Oya. And this is what I call Tim's Garden Barrels. So with the help of some power tools, a big propane blowtorch, and 40 sloped white wine bottles or juice bottles, I was able to reshape the form of a food grade barrel into 40 planting pockets, plus the top. So this time I used unglazed clay terracotta. I bought some pots from the garden center and joined them together with some all-weather fast-setting silicone. The bottom hole I clogged up with a porcelain tile with some more silicone so that I only had one entry point for the water to go in. And then you fill them up and bury them in the tops of the barrels, and they worked really well. So here I have a whole field of garden barrels all lined up. They each have a terracotta Oya watering system on top, which I filled up fairly regularly. In summer, they probably need to be filled every other day. And if I were to do it again, I would probably make 4 pots into one continuous tower all the way to the bottom of the barrel. I ended up only doing one big vessel at the top, so maybe only the top 50% has an Oya in it. But like I said, if I were to do it again, I would double that. And here we have hundreds of Albion strawberries planted into the pockets of all of these barrels. And here they are fruiting with the Albion variety of strawberries, which I mail ordered as a bare root stock from the mail. So I got several hundred plants sent to me and planted them in all the pockets of the barrels. And although the Albion variety grew really nice berries, I found out that the Canadian winter was not well suited for them, and the majority of them actually perished in the first season. So unfortunately, that didn't work out too well. Similar to the garden cube, the garden barrels have a lot of surface area to plant the various small sized plants on the edges, and then larger plants can grow up and top of the upper levels. So it worked out to be a pretty good balcony or patio planter. So despite the gardens having the clay Oya, they were still a little bit too dry for my liking, and so I decided to make another try at a mobile, smaller scale wicking garden bed. These wicking barrels used a wooden wick as well as fabric wicks rather than the sand as I did with the previous models, and I used a little bit of tongue and groove wood cedar cladding in order to make the barrel a little bit nicer to look at. So here it's planted up with green leaf lettuce. These garden barrels worked pretty well as they held their water for long periods of time and only had to be watered a few times per season, maybe once every couple of weeks or so. Also, you can interconnect these barrels to a rain tank and have them all automatically fill up, similar to what I've done in the greenhouse, which I'll get to pretty soon. So here's a couple of wicking barrels in the sunroom. It's full of zinnias, some vegetables like arugula and parsley, and a small lemon tree as well, which can be overwintered if it's close to the house and wrapped up during wintertime. So we're yet to get any fruit off of it, but hopefully this year we might see some flowers. So traditional raised beds are often raised above ground to improve the drainage of soils. If it has very compact soil, it might be another reason to go up tall, as well as it warms earlier in the spring. But like my vertical gardens, the taller you go, the better the drainage, but also the more it wants to dry out. The physical wood barrier can make a good deterrent for the grass if you've got lawn right next to a garden bed. The grass can duck under if it's a strong enough variety, but mostly this wood barrier keeps the separation between the garden and the grass, which is good because if the grass gets with your garden, it becomes quite dominant and can take over a lot of your other crops. One thing I could mention is that traditional raised beds are usually not more than 4 feet wide. This is so that you can reach all of your produce without having to step in to the soil and into the garden directly. If you do have them a little bit wider than that, some step stones might be a good idea in order to spread the body weight and prevent compaction. As well as being quite tall or taller than the in-ground gardens, it has better drainage, but then you want to cover that soil with some sort of mulch in order to lock in the moisture as well as feed the soil microbial life forms. So natural logs can make a good alternative to store-bought timber. In this case, I made what I called the Berry Boulevard. I had some old pavers, interlock bricks that I made a little pathway around an ash tree raised bed, logged raised bed garden. In this garden, I planted some raspberries, blackberries, a lot of strawberry, and a few other vegetables, and then the few stones. Since it was more than 4 feet wide, I wanted to give some access into the garden to make picking a little bit easier. It could have been a flat on-grade garden, but since I wanted to raise it up a little bit due to the utility lines that are buried fairly shallow underneath, as well as fairly compacted earth with many years of people walking on it. I also had a lot of wood chips from the arborist that I sort of needed a place for, and so for those reasons I decided to raise it up a little bit. So here's the bed again, all grown in. It has the strawberries, raspberries, kale plants, some arugula, the boysenberry, and the city tree. That was a lilac tree that they put in there. So everything grew in quite nicely. So I've talked a lot about gardening on the flats, but what about gardening on a slope? So gardening on a slope can be difficult as heavy rains can easily cause soil loss through erosion and easily dry out. So the more steep an angle, the more the water wants to flow away and not soak in. So by reshaping the landscape, it allows time to do the opposite. It allows time to sink and spread and soak in. Now, if the shapes of your terraces are exactly perfect and exactly on level, it's possible to flood them into a rice paddy, like the terraces or paddies of Asia, and have entire hillsides covered with water. Now, if they are very careful, they can control the water flow from one level to the next, and without hardly any erosion, they can easily control large volumes of water for irrigation as well as flood weed control. So then we've got Sepp Holzer and his terraces. Sepp Holzer is the Austrian mountain farmer permaculturalist that I had mentioned. He emphasizes the importances of terracing because he says that if you terrace, you don't need to fertilize or irrigate, which is 90% of the work in farming. In this case, he's reshaped a hillside to make a flat, which is nice and easy to work with and soak in from the hill above, as well as stabilizing the embankments with fruit tree roots, which then stabilize the most prone edge to the next layer of erosion. And if you do it properly, these types of work can last for generations. And then, like I mentioned, it prevents huge amounts of labor in terms of irrigation and also fertilization. So this is my scaled down version. I had a small hill in the front yard. This project I called the Tree Trunk Terrace. For most of my life, it had been sloped grass, difficult to cut, quite dry in summer. But after all the ash trees came down, we had a lot of sun and a lot of wood that I wanted to keep on property because I know that keeping the wood and all organic matter is a good way to build soils. And so it was a lot of mess at the start, but I thought I could do something with it. So this is what I came up with. I got the main trunk carefully dug into the hillside there. With the excavated soil, I filled up behind the trunk and tried to start taking the crest of the hill as level and tried to make it more and more level as I went. Then after I placed a few more large ones and started raking out the soil, I started making a little bit of clear space and started visualizing just how much height I would need for each level on terrace. I decided to make 2 levels on the one side and then more like 3 levels on the more steeper side. And as you can see here, I spread the wood chips as well as placed a lot of the logs in a somewhat creative way. But as long as it soaks and slows down all the soil or all the water that lands on it, then it should feed the soil and feed the plants without too much erosion. I started off by just spreading plants from the backyard, a lot of columbine and forget-me-not, strawberries, and garlic plants, as well as anything else that I happen to have a lot of. And by the end of the first season, strawberries had peach tree, currants, kale, parsley, cilantros, tomatoes, ground cherries, and much, much more. And you can see it's just full of growth, and it's been eaten from all season, which turned out really well. Here's the same garden, but a different side view. You can see it's full of wood chips. Some random this one big log had been placed already, but is pretty haphazard at the moment. Here it is a bit more organized with the logs in appropriate locations in order to slow and spread and sink the water. The wood chips also act as a great big sponge, especially as they break down into more humus-rich soil. And then I've got some flag stepstones, which acts as a good place to step in between the logs, which you can also step on. So here we got it all planted up with the strawberries on the left. We got some columbine and some fennel and some good King Henry, some mint plants, some asparagus up the front, and some garlic, as well as we planted the peach tree in the middle, and some black currants is around at the base of that. I also tend to sow throw my mix of seeds, which means I basically just get all my seeds in a big pile of varieties and throw them all over the place and just see what happens. And lots of different crops came up from that. You can see there's a little squash plant in the strawberry mix. There's some melons growing there and some dill plants. Had lots of parsley and some kale and all sorts of things grew in there. But I didn't have very many weed pressure because most of the seeds in the soil bank were the ones that I placed there. And having a wide variety helps to fill the canopy, which doesn't leave a lot of space for other things other than what you're trying to grow. And I found it did really well. I didn't really water it too much. I had a lot of moisture control measures in a way by having so much organic matter and so much wood, as well as the shape of the hillside itself. So I should say that sometimes if my tank from the greenhouse was too full, I would dump the tank right at the top of the hill and just sort of let it spread naturally through the rest of it. But I wouldn't go around watering, every single plant. It all just sort of shared from that source. So what about weeds? It certainly helps when your seeds are the ones coming up and you don't mind what goes where, but some gardeners want to be a little bit more organized than that, or they might be battling more aggressive weed varieties that have already been built up in the soil profile. So I'd say the most common mulch to use for most gardeners would be wood chip for their pathways and straw, which is from the grain industry after all the grain's been taken out, rather than hay, which is usually a cut of random plants in a field or sometimes specific plants, but often has their seed within it. So if you're using hay, you might be bringing in a lot of seeds that you are actually not desiring to grow. For particularly aggressive weeds, such as certain varieties of grass, for instance, people would often use cardboard or newspaper underneath wood chip as a means of really smothering and suppressing those perennials from pushing all the way back through. Living mulch. So ideally, you never want to let the sunshine hit the soil. If you've got a bunch of organic matter, that's great. But one way to get organic matter is to grow it. And so if you grow plants that you don't necessarily want to harvest, but is a very good placeholder or easy to get rid of once you want to get rid of them, or even plants that can fix nitrogen into the soil or have some other purpose other than their biomass as compost, you can use them as a placeholder until you're ready to use that soil again for your own needs. In this case, they got clover growing in between the corn rows, which they will take the corn, and then in the meantime, the soil is protected by the clover. Plastic mulches and biodegradable sheet mulches. Some vegetable farms prefer to bury large strips of plastic and plant their vegetables directly through it. There is some advantages through this, as the bed can warm up quicker, being that it's a black plastic. It tends to lock in moisture if you're irrigating underneath it, as well as it suppresses a lot of weeds around each plant. However, I don't prefer tilling as a method, as I find it contributes a lot to soil erosion, and I don't know about plastics being in the soil long term and being in direct sunlight like that. So not my preferred method. So some landscapers like to use a landscape fabric and then gravel on top of that as a means of a mulch, as a permanent mulch. The stones will protect the plastic barrier of landscape fabric, which suppresses any weeds that are trying to poke through. However, I find that eventually, sooner or later, new seeds and new organic matter find their way into the crevices of the stones and then end up growing new plants within your bed anyways. Plants always seem to find a way. They come up even in between the interlocked stones, as you can see here, And anybody that's had to interlock bricks always find that new weeds seem to find a way through. But in permaculture, as they say, the problem can be the solution. And so as this lady has done, what about patio stones as a mulch? What she's done is actually carved a little hole in between the crevices of each patio stone and put a little bit of organic compost instead of just regular sand for brick sand, and then fed those seeds with a little bit of water and was able to grow large crops of corn and eggplant, cabbage, all kinds of things, all within the crevices of her interlock stone patio. So then I thought, well, what about flagstones as a mulch? I had already experimented as flagstones as stepstones throughout the garden to reduce my weight and compaction in the garden, but I decided that I could push them a lot closer together and double them up as sort of a permanent mulch. In some areas of the back, I decided to push them much closer together, around 6 to 12 inches. In some areas, I placed them even closer together, from 1 to 3 inches. I also used logs to help terrace the slight gradual slope in the back, as well as incorporate more organic matter into the landscape. Although it looks like just a flagstone tightly placed onto soil, it actually has a large amount of buried organic matter from the compost waste of yard waste and kitchen scraps, as well as the flipped over sod of the grass that was there before I placed the stones. So basically it's a buried hugelkultur mound with the turf sit face down and then the stones laid over top. Leaves from falling trees, as well as undesired plants that grow in the garden, can easily be disposed of underneath each one of the rocks. What this does is helps any organisms that are there to give a food source to, so the millipedes and the slater bugs and the earthworms and anything else hiding under there have a food source to eat, as well as helping to compost all that organic matter back into rich fertile soil, as well as providing habitat for the bugs and protection from the birds. Sometimes even with good land design and good mulches, you still may need some additional water. Common methods of using city water irrigation are sprinklers or drip irrigation or soaker hoses. The easiest method likely being sprinklers, although some say getting moisture on the leaves of the plants can make them prone to fungal infections, and arguably top-down watering is not necessarily the most efficient compared to drip line or soaker hose. One alternative to city water is to catch the rain coming off of your roof by means of a rain barrel or a larger rain tank catchment. In my case, I used an IBC tote container, the same container I used for the garden cubes and the Wicking garden bins. You can find these containers at food grade quality, depending on what they had contained beforehand, and they come in a cage that's stackable up to 4 cubes tall. These IBC totes are about 1,000 liters in capacity and relatively cheap. You can get them secondhand, as I mentioned. Here I've got 4 stacked all together, and I got some wood bracing around the outside so I can attach some panels and make them a little bit more hidden from view. Here I've got 4 tanks all cladded together. The lower 2 tanks can be gravity fed from the house connected tanks, and then from there I'll pump up with a sub pump up into the upper tanks, where I will store it until I need it in the peak summer, and then I can gravity feed it out again through the ball valve of each tank, which I've retrofitted to make attached to a garden hose. And here's the 5 IBC totes all cladded up, the 4plex in the far distance, and then the 1 tank on a half cage cladded with wood in the front, in the foreground here. Here's an example of my automatic wicking beds. So each one of my wicking beds inside of the greenhouse doesn't get very much rain when the cover's on, and so the overflow from the rain tank overflows once full and goes into the base valve of each one of the IBC totes, and then goes to the end of the greenhouse and then has an overflow point, as most of the wicking beds does. Although this particular wicking bed is all one level, and so they all fill up and then overflow together. So I made a wood-framed greenhouse with a dirt floor. It had some garden cubes in it originally, but I found because of the lack of rainfall from the garden being inside a greenhouse and also the chimney flue that did not work well as an Oya, the gardens were particularly dry, and so I decided to just rebuild the whole thing with a garden with wicking garden beds. I started by trying to re-level the ground a little bit better and I used some old pavers that the neighbors had on their backyard patio that they were replacing. I then used 4 IBC totes again with Wicking reservoir under each garden, with a wood wick and fabric wick instead of a sand, and then some landscape fabric over top of that. Each soil platform was made from the top of the IBC container, and it's held up by several milk crates, which suspends the soil level above the water level. In the base of each water level, there's probably about 300 liters reservoir that slowly is able to wick up into the upper level of soil, and like I mentioned, it overflows before waterlogging any of the soil and flooding the whole system. I added a hugelkultur core out of all the rotted, half semi-rotted wood out of the garden cubes. At this point, it was a lot more like a giant mushroom. You could peel the parts of the wood apart with your fingers, and it was a lot more spongy and held a lot of water, and full of decomposed nutrients. Here we have the Wicking garden bins, all filled with soil and starting to automatically fill. I added ABS piping along the base connected to each ball valve, and then cladded the outside of all the containers with cedar wood. And here's all the automatic Wicking garden bins all planted up and working well. So far there's no leaks, and everything automatically tops up with water, which is nice. It makes for a really nice seedling bed, especially in early spring. Here's some salad abundance coming out of one of the Wicking garden beds early spring. And here we've got cilantro, kale, parsley, green leaf, and romaine lettuce, a little bit of dill, a little bit of poppies. And here's just a little bit of the harvest. We got some sunflowers. One way to preserve the harvest would be to lay some baking trays in the sunshine and dry things out, especially for stuff for like tea. In this case, we got a lot of peppermint tea. All ground up and put into a jar for later. Sometimes things grow unexpectedly well, and you might have an overabundance of certain things. Like in this case, I got a whole table full of parsley. And so if you've got access to a juicer, in which case I borrowed one and made a parsley juice concentrate. And then I took that parsley juice concentrate, froze it in some ice cube trays, and then I could take them out 1 cube at a time later, anytime I would like a healthy boost to a smoothie. Here are the thornless boysenberries. It's a hybrid between blackberry and raspberries. Quite a large crop of garlic that I managed to pull up from various pots in the front and backyard. We even had fresh Ontario figs, which is quite a rare treat. Growing in the greenhouse with the help of the greenhouse on the side of the right behind the Wicking garden beds. We had a great little harvest of beautiful red and gold raspberries, as well as a very large amount of mulberries from the mulberry tree. And here we have a very special strawberry to me. It's a fairly small variety, about a thumbnail-sized berry, but it's very prolific in nature. It produces a lot of berries. It's very drought tolerant and very cold tolerant. And so although I don't exactly know its name, it came from Coburg, Ontario, and I've been growing it ever since with a lot of success. And here I have 1 day's harvest from last year, front yard abundance. Bowls of berries are possible with good plant variety and good garden design. Well, that's the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening. If you would like, you can contact me for a garden consultation or possible garden installation within the Southern Ontario area. My number is 905-483-9298, and I'm Tim Burrows of urbangardensolutions.ca. Thank you very much.